It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian Coxhead, Professor of Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. ERIA's had the honor of hosting him during his stay in Jakarta for the last week.
I'm here at the invitation of one of your researchers, Rashesh Shrestha, who organized a very interesting two-day conference on human capital accumulation. And then I remained at his invitation for several more days to work with him on human capital accumulation in Vietnam, which is my area of specialization.
Thank you, Ian. With your expertise in globalization, trade, education in the ASEAN region, I have a series of questions for you today, starting off with what are the challenges facing ASEAN in terms of growth right now, and specifically with some ASEAN member states?
The developing countries of Southeast Asia face the generic challenge of accumulating productive factors, especially capital and human capital, and also new technologies, and then applying these productively in order to increase total income. Foreign investment is a very big part of that, and of course that comes bundled with new technologies. Human capital accumulation poses its own special configuration of challenges, keeping children in school, making sure that what they learn is useful, and then having them get jobs where they can apply their knowledge productively.
As a follow-on to the question about growth, I'd like to ask you to say something about the middle income trap. We've all heard about it. Can you help define it? What is it? And how can ASEAN countries avoid it?
So there is no single consensus definition of the middle income trap. I will tell you my definition, and that is a secular slowing down of economic growth caused by a decline in the rate of productivity increase. Now, where does most of that productivity growth come from? It comes from the acquisition and application of new ideas. And if a country does not invest in the means and the productive application of new ideas, then it's going to slow down and fall into what's called a middle income trap. It's not correct to call it a trap, because it's not like everything stops, it just slows down a lot.
So what are the costs of economic integration and globalization for ASEAN countries?
The benefits of global integration are clear. Countries, especially small economies such as those in Southeast Asia, benefit from participating in trade and in specializing their production to take advantage of what they do well relative to the world economy. This is just Econ 101 ideas, but they are very real. So the benefits of globalization are that countries can use their resources more efficiently. That means that they can get greater income from the existing set of resources. That's great. The costs, there are several costs. Perhaps the biggest one, at least initially, is that a country which globalizes gives up a great deal of discretion in policy. So think about particularly the countries that were more actively managed in terms of economic policy. Vietnam is a good example, but there are many others. These are countries where government wants to obtain gains from globalization, but in order to do that has to engage in an institutional way, a rules-based way with the global economy. That means that they lose a great deal of discretion over economic policy.
And following up on that, what policies can ASEAN countries implement in order to maximize the benefits of economic integration?
Maximizing the benefits depends on the country we're talking about. If we're thinking, for example, about Indonesia, which is a resource-rich country, then Indonesia can do very well in the short run to medium run, by specializing in resource extractive activities, mining, oil palm plantations and so on, and then using the foreign exchange earned from their export to invest into other kinds of activities. But there are some real risks in doing that, and Indonesia exemplifies those risks. First of all, environmental risks, secondly, resource depletion, and thirdly, the productive application of the foreign exchange that's earned in that way. There are real downside risks in all of those. Other countries that don't have such abundant natural resources, their benefits really come from integrating their labor force with the global economic system. So the poorer countries of the region, think about Cambodia, think about Vietnam. In a previous generation, think about Thailand and the Philippines. These are countries whose net benefits from globalization really came from making sure that they were making the most productive use of the resources that they have that are different from the rest of the world. Mostly low-skilled labor, but not entirely that.
Can I ask you to say a little bit more about the benefits of globalization?
Sure. So again, Econ 101 teaches us that there are winners and losers from trade. That's inevitable. In a developing country context, where income typically grows very fast with globalization, at least initially, the difference between winners and losers is mostly a difference of degree. It's not like there are people who are losing in absolute terms, but there are people who are left behind. And what we've learned over the years is that the key to the equitable distribution of gains from globalization is a well-functioning labor market. Why? Because first of all, everybody participates in the labor market. Everyone has a job and earns in one way from their participation. Second, the extent to which people, workers, individuals are mobile or immobile in the labor market conditions their ability to take advantage of opportunities created by globalization and trade. People who can move freely, change jobs, change location, migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas, can do very, very well out of globalization. Those who are restricted in their mobility, for example, by an attachment to land or credit market failures or some other constraint, typically get left behind. And so when we look at the distributional consequences of globalization, the labor market is by far the most effective lens through which to examine that.
Then how should the region respond to the global trade tensions and the current backlash against globalization?
The economies of Southeast Asia are all small economies in the global market. They don't have the power to influence what happens in the market. So in some sense, they've just got to roll with the punches. I think the ASEAN countries as a group have done very well at speaking with a much louder voice by getting together, not only within ASEAN, but of course the various ASEAN Plus configurations that are out there. That has helped to give them a very effective voice. ASEAN as a group accounts for almost 10% of global trade, so it's a big deal. And this has been a very effective strategy for them. Individual countries can't do much. As a group, ASEAN can be more effective. I'm old enough to remember when ASEAN was mostly a political grouping, not an economic grouping. The progress that was made at really about the beginning of the 21st century with the formation of AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area, and then ASEAN participation in broader regional groupings of a whole variety of kinds, that has been really effective. So that we can see that in intra-ASEAN trade. And we can see that also in the pattern of specialization that's taking place within ASEAN and between ASEAN and the rest of the world. So there's a lot of efficiency gains being captured. First through greater economic integration within ASEAN, secondly through ASEAN's more coherent approach to the participation in the global economy.
Shifting the topic slightly, is automation and the fourth industrial revolution going to be a problem for this region? And if so, how can the region address the challenges?
Automation will undermine the capacity to create large-scale employment for low-skilled workers. That's inevitable. The industries which have been the last frontier of automation, such as garments and footwear and furniture, are all becoming targets for automation now. That means that the strategy that has worked very well in the past of creating a lot of jobs for relatively low-skilled workers from mostly rural areas, that strategy is not going to be as robust in the future. That's a very, very big challenge for the region. However, the other thing that we need to know about ASEAN, with almost no exceptions, is that the pace of population growth, and therefore labor force growth, is declining very, very fast. So it's kind of a race against time. in ASEAN. On the one hand, technologies are taking away jobs for low-skilled workers. On the other hand, the number of new entrants, especially to the low-skilled labour market, is declining. The rate at which new entrants are joining the labour market is declining very, very fast. Indonesian population growth is falling below replacement rate. Of course, the dynamics of population growth mean that population will continue to grow for some time yet, but the number of new labour market entrants is falling every year. And we can see that in countries that have had, more clearly, in countries that have had far more aggressive approaches to limiting population growth. So every successive cohort in Vietnam at the moment is 1 or 2 million smaller than the previous cohort, 5-year cohort, I should say.
As someone who sits outside of the region and is working in an academic institution, can you say a little more about the current academic discussions that are occurring around these issues of trade and globalization?
As a whole, the region has not done well. So the poorer countries of the region have not done well in producing a flexible, creative, skilled labour force. They have relied very heavily on less skilled jobs, which can pay pretty well, but which don't provide lifetime employment in a very dynamic way. So the region as a whole now confronts the challenge of investing in human capital in a strategic way, in a way that makes sense not only for current job market needs, but looking into the future and thinking about how that job market will evolve, how technology will impact it, and what kinds of skills and abilities and capabilities will be appropriate, not just now, but 20, 30 years from now. I think one of the most interesting and most dynamic areas of this takes advantage of the increasing availability of microdata, data from individual firms or plants, and especially employer-employee matched data, which is scarce in the developing world but becoming more and more available. With these kinds of data, we can ask very detailed quantitative questions about the impacts of particular policies, and acquisition of new technologies and investments at the level of the firm, at the level of the enterprise, and use those to generate, I think, very interesting, very important discussions about productivity growth, about the capacity for specialization, and about the distributional consequences of these things.
Lastly, how can organizations like ERIA contribute to the discussions about trade and integration?
Okay, so ERIA is an almost unique institution in that it's got a regional reach and a great deal of regional special knowledge. So that sets it apart from all of the national institutions that have overlapping mandates with ERIA. So ERIA researchers, I think, have a really nice perspective on the region. They have the opportunity to look across the region and engage in comparative research, which I think is very productive in this region. When I teach my class about Southeast Asia, I tell the students, Southeast Asia is like a little mini laboratory in economic development. It's got one of every kind of country. There are capitalists and communists, there are resource-rich, resource-poor, large economies, small economies, and so on. And yet they have a tremendous amount of common heritage in terms of geography, a lot of their history, and of course their interactions with the rest of the global economy based on their geographical location. And with those common elements, we can learn a great deal from the experience of one group of countries and apply it to another. So I think ERIA has a comparative advantage in doing that.